kind of oppressive humidity that made every breath feel heavy and every step deliberate. Dean Wallace wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his weathered hand, adjusting the strap of his camera bag as he navigated the narrow trail that wound deeper into the protected woodland. At 52, Dean had spent the better part of 2 decades capturing wildlife through his lens, but today felt different. The forest seemed unusually quiet, as if even the birds were holding their breath against the stifling air. His weathered hiking boots crunched softly on the carpet of dead leaves, the only sound breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the reserve. He paused at a fork in the trail, consulting the worn map folded in his shirt pocket. The eastern path led to a section of old-growth forest where he'd heard rumors of a rare piloted woodpecker nesting. It was exactly the kind of shot that could make his next nature photography exhibition something special. Dean had been coming to Red Hollow for years, long before the incident that made headlines across the state. Back then, it was just another beautiful stretch of protected wilderness, popular with hikers and birdwatchers. Now, 11 years after that night, most people avoided the deeper trails. The reserve still carried an invisible weight, a reputation that kept the casual visitors away. As he took the eastern path, Dean couldn't help but remember the news coverage that had dominated local television for months. 27 young people, gone without a trace after an illegal rave deep in the forest. He'd been living in Portland then, working for a nature magazine, but the story had reached him even there. The mystery of their disappearance had captivated the entire Pacific Northwest. The trail began to climb, winding between massive Douglas firs whose canopy blocked out much of the afternoon sun. Dean moved carefully, his photographer's eye constantly scanning for movement, for the perfect composition, for that moment when light and subject aligned in perfect harmony. It was then that he saw it. About 15 feet off the trail, caught on a dead branch at eye level, something fluorescent green fluttered in the barely perceptible breeze. Dean stopped abruptly, his heart skipping a beat. In all his years of wilderness photography, he'd developed an instinct for things that didn't belong, and this definitely didn't belong. He approached slowly, camera already in hand, though something told him this wasn't the kind of discovery he'd want to document just yet. The object was a fabric bracelet, the kind sold at music festivals and concerts, its neon green color still vivid, despite what must have been years of exposure to the elements. But it wasn't just the bracelet that made Dean's breath catch in his throat. Wrapped around the fabric, partially hidden by the angle of the branch, was something that made his hands tremble as he reached for his phone instead of his camera. A laminated ID badge. Even from a distance he could make out the partial text, "Summer Solstice Underground, Admit One." Dean's mind raced back to the newspaper articles he'd read years ago. The rave had been called Summer Solstice Underground, organized through underground forums and word of mouth. The kind of event that drew young people from across the region, all looking for one night of freedom in the wilderness. He pulled out his phone, grateful for the single bar of signal that somehow reached this remote corner of the reserve. His hands were shaking as he took several photos of the bracelet and ID badge, still hanging there like a monument to that night 11 years ago. The official search had covered hundreds of square miles, involving search and rescue teams, bloodhounds, and even helicopters equipped with thermal imaging. They'd found the abandoned campsite where the rave had taken place, complete with scattered tents, backpacks, and sound equipment. But no people, no signs of struggle, no trail to follow. Dean carefully examined the area around the tree, looking for any other signs, any clues that might have been missed during the initial investigation. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves and undergrowth, but his trained eye caught something else, a depression in the earth, partially concealed by ferns and moss that seemed too regular to be natural. He knelt down, brushing away the vegetation with gentle movements. What he found underneath made him sit back on his heels, his photographer's objectivity warring with a growing sense of unease. The depression was roughly circular, about 3 feet in diameter and completely devoid of plant life. The soil looked different too, darker, more compact, as if something had compressed it with tremendous force. Around the edges, he could see what looked like scorch marks, though they were so faded he couldn't be certain. Dean stood up, his eyes moving from the bracelet to the strange marking on the ground, then to the surrounding trees. For the first time in his career, he found himself hoping he wouldn't find what he was looking for. But his photographer's instincts were stronger than his fear, and he began to notice other things that didn't fit the natural pattern of the forest. More depressions in the earth, barely visible under years of accumulated debris. Branches broken at unnatural angles, their wounds long since healed, but still visible to someone who knew how to look. And in the distance, barely audible over the afternoon stillness, what sounded almost like an echo, not of his own movements, but of something else entirely. Dean realized he was holding his breath. In all his years of wilderness photography, he'd never felt anything like the tension that was building in his chest. This wasn't just about finding a piece of evidence from an old mystery. This was about standing in a place where something terrible had happened, something that had left scars on the landscape that time hadn't been able to heal. He looked once more at the fluorescent bracelet, swaying gently in the humid air, and made a decision that would change everything. Dean's hands trembled as he carefully removed the bracelet from the branch, handling it like the crucial piece of evidence it had become. The laminated ID badge crinkled softly in the humid air, its edges worn, but the text still clearly readable. He slipped both items into a clear plastic bag from his camera kit, the kind he normally used to protect his equipment from moisture. The drive back to Cedar Falls took 47 minutes, but Dean's mind was racing faster than his pickup truck on the winding mountain roads. He kept glancing at the passenger seat where the evidence lay, wondering if he should have called the police immediately. But something held him back, perhaps the photographer's instinct to gather the complete story before revealing it to the world. Cedar Falls hadn't changed much in the 11 years since the disappearances. The small logging town still consisted of one main street lined with family-owned shops, a diner that served as the unofficial community center, and rows of modest houses where everyone knew everyone else's business. Population 3,847, according to the sign at the town limits. Though Dean suspected that number was optimistic, he parked outside the Cedar Falls Public Library, a brick building that had served the community since 1952. Margaret Chen, the librarian, looked up from her desk with surprise as Dean entered. Visitors were rare on weekday afternoons, especially ones carrying camera bags and looking as unsettled as Dean did. "Mr. Wallace?" Margaret said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Researching another photography project?" "Something like that," Dean replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to look up some old newspaper archives, from 2013 specifically." Margaret's expression shifted slightly. In a town like Cedar Falls, mentioning 2013 meant only one thing. "The summer solstice incident," she said quietly. "We have everything on microfiche, plus some digital archives the Herald created. Follow me." The library's research section occupied a quiet corner, surrounded by tall windows that normally filled the space with natural light. But the late afternoon clouds had gathered, casting long shadows across the empty tables. Margaret set up the microfiche reader and pulled several boxes from a locked cabinet. "The search lasted 4 months," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through the town's darkest period. "FBI, state police, search and rescue teams. My nephew Danny was one of the missing." Her hands paused over the film canisters. "He was 19, studying forestry at Oregon State. Good kid, never caused trouble." Dean felt the weight of the evidence in his camera bag. "I'm sorry for your loss." "We never got closure," Margaret continued, loading the first film. "The investigation just stopped. One day there were agents everywhere, helicopters flying overhead. Then suddenly they packed up and left, said they'd exhausted all leads." She looked directly at Dean. "But you didn't come here for a history lesson. What did you find out there?" Dean hesitated, then pulled out his phone, showing her the photos he'd taken. Margaret's sharp intake of breath filled the quiet library. "Dear God," she whispered, leaning closer to the screen. "That's Danny's bracelet. He made it himself, learned macrame from his grandmother. I'd recognize that pattern anywhere." The newspaper headlines from June 2013 told the story in stark black and white. 27 missing after illegal rave. Search enters third week. FBI takes over investigation. Families demand answers. Then, gradually, the headlines grew smaller, pushed to inside pages as other news took precedence. Dean scrolled through article after article, building a timeline in his mind. The rave had been organized through encrypted forums, drawing young people from across the Pacific Northwest. The event location had been kept secret until the last moment, revealed only through coded messages to ticket holders. But as Dean read deeper, he noticed something the original investigators might have missed. The articles mentioned other disappearances in the region, scattered across several years before and after the rave incident. Individual cases that never made major headlines, hikers who never returned, campers whose tents were found empty, hunters who vanished without a trace. "Margaret," Dean said, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you remember any other disappearances in the area before 2013? The librarian's face grew pale. "You think they're connected?" Dean pulled out a notebook and began writing down dates and names from the scattered articles. Jason Mitchell, aged 24, disappeared while hiking alone in March 2011. Sarah and Tom Brennan, both 31, vanished during a camping trip in August 2012. Their car found abandoned at a trailhead. Lisa Park, 28, went missing during a solo backpacking expedition in October 2014. All within a 30-mile radius of Red Hollow, all in areas that connected to the same trail system where Dean had found the bracelet. As the afternoon faded into evening, Dean and Margaret worked in focused silence, pulling every article, police report, and missing person notice they could find. The pattern that emerged was disturbing in its consistency. People vanished without leaving any trace, their disappearances separated by just enough time and distance to avoid triggering any larger investigation. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to a small article from September 2015. Forest Service ranger reported unusual geological activity in the Red Hollow area. Ground subsidence, changes in local wildlife behavior, water sources drying up unexpectedly. Dean felt a chill run down his spine as he remembered the circular depression he'd found near the bracelet, the scorched earth, the compressed soil, the unnatural silence of the forest. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging or join them." Dean showed the message to Margaret, whose face went white. "We need to call the police," she said. But Dean was already thinking beyond the immediate threat. Someone knew what he'd found, which meant someone had been watching. More importantly, it meant someone knew what had really happened to those 27 young people, and all the others who had vanished over the years. "Not yet," Dean said, his photographer's instincts overriding his fear. "First, I need to go back to the forest. I need to document everything before anyone else knows we're investigating." Margaret grabbed his arm. "You can't go back there alone. Not now." Dean looked at the evidence spread across the library table, at the photos on his phone, at the message from the unknown number. For the first time in his career, he was part of the story he was trying to tell, and he knew that tomorrow, everything would change. The morning fog clung to Red Hollow like a shroud as Dean returned to the forest, accompanied this time by Margaret and her neighbor Tom Rodriguez, a retired state trooper who had worked the original investigation. Tom's weathered face carried the weight of 11 years of unanswered questions, his grey eyes sharp despite his 73 years. "I always knew we missed something," Tom said, adjusting his old service weapon in its holster. "The FBI boys came in with their fancy equipment and theories, but they didn't know this forest like we do." "They do." They followed the same trail Dean had taken the day before, but everything felt different now. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of green that filtered the weak morning light into strange patterns on the forest floor. Birds that should have been singing their dawn chorus remained silent. Margaret walked between the two men, clutching a thermos of coffee that had grown cold an hour ago. She hadn't slept after receiving 3 more threatening messages during the night, each one more specific than the last. The final message had included her home address. "There," Dean said, pointing to the tree where he'd found the bracelet. In the grey morning light, the spot looked different, less sinister but somehow more sad, like a memorial that no one had meant to create. Tom approached the circular depression in the earth with the methodical patience of someone who had spent decades examining crime scenes. He knelt down, brushing away the accumulated debris with gentle movements, revealing the full extent of the marking. "This wasn't in any of our reports," he said, his voice troubled. "We searched this area 6 times, and we never saw this." Dean was already setting up his camera equipment, determined to document everything before anyone could stop them. Through his telephoto lens, he could see details that weren't visible to the naked eye, patterns in the scorched earth, subtle variations in soil color, and something else that made him pause. "There are others," he said quietly. Following Dean's gaze, Tom and Margaret could see them now. More circular depressions, arranged in what looked like a deliberate pattern extending deeper into the forest. Some were partially hidden by undergrowth, others obscured by fallen logs. But once you knew what to look for, they became impossible to ignore. "How many?" Margaret whispered. Dean counted through his camera's viewfinder. 27. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft click of Dean's camera shutter as he documented each marking. 27 depressions, 27 missing people. The connection was too obvious to ignore. Tom stood up slowly, his knees protesting after years of police work. "We need to call this in," he said. "This is evidence of a mass crime." "Evidence of what crime?" Margaret asked. "We still don't know what happened to them." That's when they heard it, the sound that made all 3 of them freeze. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the forest's morning stillness, came the rhythmic thump of bass music, electronic beats that seemed to pulse from deep within the earth itself. Dean lowered his camera. "Do you hear that?" Tom's hand moved instinctively to his weapon. In 42 years of law enforcement, he'd learned to trust his instincts. And every instinct he had was screaming danger. The sound grew louder, accompanied now by what sounded like voices. Not quite human, but not quite anything else either. The 3 of them stood transfixed as the music seemed to move through the forest, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We need to leave," Tom said, but his voice was barely a whisper. "Now." They began backing toward the trail, but Margaret suddenly stopped. "Wait," she said, pointing to one of the depressions. "Something's different." Dean followed her gaze and felt his blood turn cold. The circular marking that had been empty and dead was now showing signs of fresh disturbance. The soil looked recently turned, and there were footprints around the edge, fresh footprints that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. The music stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. Then from the direction of the original rave site came a new sound, voices calling out in languages that none of them recognized, punctuated by what sounded like equipment being moved through the underbrush. Tom drew his weapon, his training overriding the fear that was threatening to paralyze him. "Move," he ordered. "Back to the truck, now." They ran through the forest with an urgency born of pure terror, branches catching at their clothes, and roots threatening to trip them with every step. Behind them, the sounds grew closer, not pursuit exactly, but something worse. The sound of people who weren't trying to catch them because they already knew where they were going. Dean's truck came into view just as his phone began buzzing with messages. Not text messages this time, but photos. Photos of Margaret's house, photos of Tom's retirement community, photos of Dean's own cabin on the outskirts of town. The final message was a video, shaky footage shot from inside Red Hollow, showing the exact spot where they'd been standing just minutes earlier. The timestamp showed it had been recorded 3 hours ago, before they'd even arrived. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had been waiting. As they reached the truck, Tom grabbed Dean's arm. "Those depressions," he said, breathing heavily from the run. "They're not where people disappeared from. They're where people are buried." Margaret looked back toward the forest, where the strange music had started again, now accompanied by lights that flickered between the trees like some impossible aurora. "Danny's still in there," she whispered. "They're all still in there." Dean started the engine with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. In his rear-view mirror, he could see figures moving among the trees, too distant to make out clearly, but close enough to know they were being watched. As they drove away from Red Hollow, none of them spoke about the most terrifying realization of all. Whatever had taken those 27 young people 11 years ago was still happening, still active, still claiming victims. And now it knew they were investigating. The Cedar Falls police station felt smaller that evening, with 3 terrified people huddled around Chief Sandra Martinez's desk while she reviewed Dean's photographs. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look frightened. "This changes everything," Chief Martinez said. "Tom, you were right. The FBI missed this completely." Tom Rodriguez sat rigidly, his retired trooper's instincts sharp. "They didn't miss it, Sandy. They covered it up." Margaret clutched her nephew's bracelet, the fabric worn smooth. Dean's camera lay open on the desk, its memory card containing evidence that could reopen the county's most infamous case. "We need to dig," Chief Martinez said. "Official excavation. Forensic team." "They won't let us," Margaret said quietly. "Whoever's sending those messages has resources. They knew we were coming." Chief Martinez's phone rang. The conversation was brief and increasingly tense. When she hung up, her face had gone pale. "Forest Service, Red Hollow is being closed for geological survey work. Effective immediately. 30 days, no access." Dean felt something cold in his stomach. "How long since you called about excavation?" 20 minutes. Chief Martinez pulled out a topographical map. "There's another way. Old logging roads connect to tunnels under Red Hollow. Mining days, 1890s. Tom studied the map with decades of expertise. "Dangerous. Those tunnels haven't been maintained in a century." "More dangerous than leaving families without answers?" Margaret asked. 2 hours later, they approached through abandoned logging roads that didn't appear on modern maps. Dean carried camera equipment and lighting. Chief Martinez brought police recording equipment and her weapon. Tom carried a borrowed metal detector. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind overgrown blackberry vines, marked by a rusted sign, "Danger, unstable ground." Dean's flashlight revealed a passage descending sharply, supported by rotting timber beams from frontier days. "Mine shafts connect to natural caves," Chief Martinez explained as they descended. "County records show they run under the evidence area." The tunnels were narrow, forcing single file through passages that smelled of damp earth and something organic. Dean's camera flash created stark shadows on rough stone walls, illuminating abandoned century-old mining equipment. After nearly an hour underground, Tom's metal detector chirped frantically. The sound echoed through tunnels, creating an eerie electronic symphony. "Here," Tom said, kneeling beside a natural depression. "Something's buried." Dean set up equipment while Chief Martinez excavated carefully. What they found made Margaret gasp and step backward. Personal belongings, dozens, arranged in neat piles like macabre inventory. Wallets with intact identification, jewelry glinting in flashlight beams, cell phones in waterproof cases. Everywhere, colorful fabric of festival wristbands and concert tickets. "Danny's wallet," Margaret whispered, reaching for leather she recognized. Inside, his forestry student ID was perfectly preserved, along with a girlfriend's photo and $43. Chief Martinez made the discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath personal effects, official government documentation sealed in plastic bags bearing multiple federal agency letterheads. "Experimental containment protocols," she read aloud. "Subject termination procedures, evidence disposal guidelines." Her voice quieted with each document. This wasn't just cover-up. This was an operation. Dean's camera captured every document, every piece of evidence. The papers told a story of government experiments gone wrong, of young people who unknowingly walked into a testing ground for technology that should never have existed. Summer Solstice Underground hadn't been organized by music lovers. It was a trap designed to gather test subjects in isolated locations where disappearance could be explained and forgotten. "We need media," Dean said, photographers' instincts overriding fear. "Every major outlet, every investigative journalist who can tell this story." Tom's detector had gone silent, but they heard something else. The same electronic music from above echoing through tunnels. This time, not from the surface. From deeper underground, from passages old mining maps didn't show. "They're still down here," Margaret whispered. The experiments never stopped. Chief Martinez made a career-defining decision. "We're going public with everything. Tonight, full disclosure, full documentation, full protection for witnesses." Climbing toward surface, carrying evidence that would expose decades of cover-ups and government malfeasance, Dean realized his nature photography expedition had become something larger. Red Hollow wasn't just about 27 missing young people. It was about truth so dangerous that powerful people spent 11 years burying it. But now, finally, it would be told. 3 months later, Dean Wallace's photographs appeared on newspaper front pages nationwide. The Red Hollow files led to congressional hearings, federal investigations, and dozens of official resignations. Most importantly, it provided answers for families who waited 11 years to learn truth about their missing loved ones. The forest is quiet now, protected by federal marshals and congressional oversight. But sometimes, late at night, hikers report hearing electronic music from deep underground, where some secrets may never be fully revealed. In Cedar Falls, a memorial garden grows where 27 young people are finally remembered, their names carved in stone beneath words. Truth will always find its way to the light.
If you want to hear the rest of this story, please leave a comment on this video and subscribe.